Hi, my name is Daniel Lieberman. I work for BitPusher. And this talk is sort of predicated on a somewhat presumptuous assertion, which is that BitPusher, who is orders of magnitude smaller than Google, faces some similar operations challenges, and that our perspective on some of that stuff may be useful to you, and I hope it is. So the general concept behind the talk. So we're. Introduce yourself. Oh, I didn't. Yeah, I didn't give a whole lot of background. So I've been doing internet operations for well, my career sort of followed when I was in academia. The internet was an academic thing. Went to nonprofit. Kind of been with the whole internet space for a long time. Started as a systems administrator. Done operations management, run Knox, stuff like that, and then a few years ago I started my own company doing web operations. And so what BitPusher does is we work with small companies, or actually some of them are large companies, but small web applications where it doesn't necessarily make sense for them to hire their own team, or they just want it done more efficiently than you can do a team when you're managing a relatively small environment. So, and well, I guess I've kind of covered a little bit about BitPusher. And so our approach is as a kind of complete outsource, right? So we look at it as it's our job to make it unnecessary for our customers to have a web operations team at all. They've got their developers, and then operations is a different set of competencies, and that's what we focus on. One of the things that comes up fairly frequently for us is the other companies that have on paper the same portfolio of services are. IBM Global Services will sell the same combination of the services and the infrastructure. We do the hosting as well and get a lot of efficiencies out of that, which is actually where the core of the talk is. And so we find ourselves actually competing on a number of deals with IBM Global Services, MCI, and AT&T, their consulting arms, things like that. And even when we're not, because those are the only companies that have the same nominal set of services, we're often asked to compare ourselves. And again, on paper, we look very similar. One of the things that comes out right away when we're actually bidding against them is we end up being about a third of the cost. And given that we're providing the same set of services, people are a little bit suspicious of that at first. And again, that's sort of where I'm going with this talk, is on some of the things we do to address that challenge of being efficient. And in particular, in our context, the big challenge is efficiency, managing a lot of different services on the same infrastructure. And the thing that comes up that fundamentally distinguishes the way we go about the web operations problem relative to these larger companies is, if you go to IBM, yeah, they're going to obviously use their facilities and their network, but they're going to essentially treat each web application as a silo, that it's its own thing, and focus on, all right, what's the best way to do each of these layers for your environment? And we take a different approach, and it's not a black and white thing, but our whole outlook on it is that we've got one infrastructure platform that we're taking these services and figuring out how to integrate them into that platform and do it efficiently. So, and really the biggest way this changes the game is that we're tackling different problems. When you're asking what's the best way to set up this service, and you're really just looking at that service, you're going to ask very different questions than what's the best way to integrate this service into a larger environment. And so the fundamental challenge you end up with is, we're going to keep taking on more and more diversity in our environment, and we still want to keep those economies of scale, make it as efficient as possible, even though we're going to have a pile of different services. And in our case, we have really very little say about the code, right? These are services that people are writing. We don't support every language out there, but we have a variety of languages, a variety of platforms. But the goal is to maintain the efficiency as that grows. And so I have kind of two quick answers to how do we tackle that. One is all right, we're not reinventing the wheel for each customer, right? We're not looking at every choice about how do you configure Apache or how do you configure this layer or that layer separately for each customer. For the most part, you've got configurations that work and that you know what their properties are, no need to reinvent that. Of course, the flip side of that is some applications need some amounts of customization, so you can't be foolish about it. And an even more flip answer is smart processes, right? It's about how do you tackle the task, how do you go about it. It's not the magic isn't in some piece of technical magic that we bring to the table. It's really about how do we go through the steps that we go through, and what are those steps. So before I get into the real meat of the talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about the relationship between process and work. I mean, the first thing is, when people talk about process, oftentimes they talk about it in a very sort of prescriptive mindset, right? Okay, so you design processes, and that tells you how to work. Well, the reality is that's not how things work in the real world, right? If you design processes in a vacuum, they're not actually going to be implemented, and getting good at that feedback loop is what's going to get you good processes that actually work with the way your operations team operates. And my perspective on this is the reason you hire smart people is to design processes. Not a reason you hire them, the reason you hire them. If you can hire people who are competent and you can automate a lot of things with computers, and that's great for executing processes that exist. But the whole reason you need smart people is because you don't already know this is the best way to do it, right? So I mean, to me, this is a premise of almost any kind of team work environment, is that you really need to get that feedback loop going. You're hiring smart people to think, and to think about what's always improving it, what's a better way to do it, and so forth. Actually covered that. So I'm going to define something that I call an economy of focus. And what it is, it's a choice of problems to solve with certain criteria for those problems. So first, you're trying to pick. Actually, let me step back for just a sec. So the reason I'm talking about economies of focus is when I looked at our own processes and particularly when I get asked that question about how do we do what we do so much cheaper than a lot of big companies do, I know it's in our processes, right? But when I really sat down and said, all right, what's the key magic? There's several pieces, but economies of focus really stood out. And again, so an economy of focus is it's a choice of problems to solve. So you start with a big task. I've got this service, that maybe I have code for it, but I've got a service, I've got an operations infrastructure, I've got to implement now, right? So that can be divided into problems in quite a number of different ways. And so the criteria for choosing those problems that would make it an economy of focus is, one, you choose problems which are not broad. You're saying, all right, I can have someone fairly quickly become a master at this, right? So if I'm tackling a web server configuration, I'm not going to define the problem as setting up Apache in the best possible way, right? I'm going to narrow it down with a set of criteria that are appropriate for my environment. At the same time that it's narrow, it has to be broad in the sense that you've chosen a problem that solution is going to be useful in lots of different places in the environment. So if I'm restricting down to 2 or 3 different ways of setting up Apache, I really want to choose those intelligently so that that's going to cover as many possible cases as it can. And then the third thing that actually turns it into an economy of focus is that you really master it. You own that process. It becomes something that you're really good at, you as an organization. And so it's sort of this kind of combination of we've narrowed down the problem or chosen problems at a manageable level. We've chosen them intelligently, so we're going to be able to apply them in a broad set of contexts. And then we said, all right, those we're going to master. We're going to say we're going to be real experts in that narrow set. And the other thing in terms of the guiding, in terms of economies of focus at a high level, it's, like a lot of things, it's, can you necessarily say, oh, this is an economy of focus and this isn't? It's not black and white. It's a set of guiding principles. This is not process in the descriptive process sense, right? This is an approach that gets us to a place where we can manage diversity in an efficient way. So when you're looking at these, all right, what's the problem domain, right? What are the things that you need to solve? The most obvious target for this approach is your specific technical choices, right? Like I was talking about with Apache, narrow that down. But I think, as important as a target for this approach or a place to apply this is applying it to a variety of the processes that you do day to day, right? So, by thinking through how you deploy, and by deployment, I mean that initial process of taking the service and implementing it on the infrastructure. In addition to the technical choices, there's the ways you go about it. How do you project manage that? How do you choose those steps? Same things apply in other pieces of the process puzzle as well. So I'm starting looking at the technical design and configuration aspect, because that's sort of the most obvious and easiest to talk about. And the point here is you could look at, however you divide up the layers that you're looking at your problem, you can look at each of these as a fairly wide set of problems to solve, or a broad, there's huge realm, even just from an operations perspective, there's a huge realm within operating systems, right, that you can say, all right, let's master the best way to set it up. But obviously, you don't need to do that to set something up, right? So when you actually narrow it down, the whole point is let's take each of the different layers that we're looking at and try to make it, all right, within operating systems, we're going to choose one standard configuration, very limited set of things. We may have groups of packages that we do or don't install or whatever, but that can be reduced to almost a non-problem, almost fully automated in an operations environment. Some layers are easier to filter down than others. I'm going to talk in a minute more about, in more specifics about those. But before I do, I wanted to comment a little bit on, again, an economy of focus is a choice of problems, right? So when you're choosing problems, in a technical realm, usually you look at things in terms of a set of layers. And there's usually when you're choosing those layers, you're trying to look for, what's sort of the canonical set of layers? What's the most technically elegant set of layers? And my suggestion is that it actually makes more sense to be a little more pragmatic and say, all right, keep it technologically simple. Don't create a complex problem, but let's divide the problem into layers in a way that, in particular, what we found matters is it fits the way you update that layer, and it fits the way it fits the kinds of customizations and the modes of customization that you need to apply to that layer. And I'm going to go through a little bit the specific layers that we use. And the point isn't to say these are the best layers, but I'm going to use them to explain how we've used our choice of layers to narrow down the problem space so that we can solve those the set of small problems in order to apply broadly to the diversity of services on a single infrastructure. Obviously, things you're taking stock out of the operating system, we use an existing distro, we use its existing update service, right? We do filter the updates, make sure that sanity check it, but pretty much this is sort of obvious how you narrow that down. One thing about this is that we don't. You can add. Sorry, I lost the thought there. So two things about this. One is that we don't worry too much about being too precise about exactly what's allowed in and what's allowed out. What's the set of packages we're installing? That actually, in our experience, at a huge scale, it probably causes you a lot of grief to have some variation in exactly what set of packages are installed. But we're at a decent scale, and for us, it's sort of okay. So long as we track that application has those dependencies, we don't stress too much about that, right? The other thing is we take out of that layer packages that we often customize. We don't say, well, if the version in the distro is good enough for us, we use it, and otherwise we don't. No, it keeps it much cleaner to say if we customize it almost ever, we don't count it in this layer, right? Because it's going to be updated a different way, it's going to be customized a different way, and then you get confused because it's one of the things that really helps is knowing with an economy of focus what is part of the problem you're solving and what's not, right? So we know, Apache is never part of OS stock, right? And a lot of those different layers that usually get customized or may often get customized, we just say, no, they're not going to be part of this layer. We're going to treat them a different way. We also have our set of stock packages and sort of standard configurations like our NTP configuration, which is pretty much the same across the board, right? These also, like operating system, yes, there's some R&D work that goes into creating, maintaining this more than at the operating system level, but pretty much it's also from an operations perspective, it's a set of things, automated deployments, automated updates. Though there is a bit of a different process because we're not using the operating system stock feeding process, so it makes sense for us to manage this as a separate layer. Then we have, for us, the things like Apache and MySQL and whichever language they're using and so forth. I call those different things middleware. That's just my term for the layers of software that you're not considering part of the operating system, but they aren't the application code either. They're your support tools. They're your software stack. And within this realm, these get updated very differently. Each service does need attention when we update these, and the customizations happen on a per service, or for us, that's a per customer basis. So it doesn't squash it down to as little work, either in the setup or on an ongoing basis, as these other layers, because it can't, right? Because a lot of that, you do need to factor in what is specific to that service. But we try, when I say template-based, the point is that we're going to try to take that and say, they vary, but vary within a relatively small space. We're going to say, all right, the Apache configuration, yeah, we've got 2 or 3 basic templates, and you start from there, minor modifications. But because we have a diversity of services that, because we have a wide diversity of services, we don't try to list, here are the choices you're allowed to make on these. For the most part, we say, let's make them, let's allow any customization, but that doesn't really make it completely different, which we'll handle it at a different level. But we don't have a specific set of rules, because we can't anticipate every customization that isn't a radical change that we might want to make. So then we have what I call the one-off middleware packages. This is where we're installing something that really is unique to this service, whether it's a package we don't do anywhere else, or it just needs to be configured in a way that, that's unique enough that it's not templatized. That again, we choose it as we separate that out as a different layer because it's going to be updated and customized in a different way. What I call the always unique configuration, this is actually an easier part than it sounds like, because this is things like, your which service, what are the public-facing services associated with this application at at an IP and port level. So this layer for us, though, so this refers to a lot of the different networking things that are inherently, all right, define what the public face of this application is. This needs to go into a bunch of different places, right? So this needs to go not just on the servers, but also into the load balancers and firewalls. And so this stands out as its own layer. It's just interacted with very differently. And again, that the update and customization are different. The application code itself is sort of a different piece of the puzzle, right? The way we look at it and the way most operations organizations look at it, the code is something you may have some say in the code. You may be able to define standards, but it's not really the operations realm. And then the last piece is the automation that you do for deploying and administering a given service. And that's another one. Obviously, it's different. It's heavy on internal R&D as far as how it's developed. The way we manage it is also sort of a template model, but at a larger scale, probably would be much more formulaic and automated. But still, it's going to be, again, a different set of problems, a different set of things to master. So as I mentioned before, while the technical realm is the most obvious place to say, all right, let's figure out how to narrow down our problem domain, the processes are actually at least as relevant and interesting because, well, it's the part that you tend to not be as conscious about, and sometimes you find these tend to be very personal, right? So you'll get somebody who's really good at defining the set of parameters for setting up the service, what I'm calling the specification realm, and at some point those processes mature to the point where you have everyone doing it the same way, but it's not as obvious that they're all going to be done the same way by different people. People tend to say, all right, I'm really good at this. I have my magic for doing it. So-and-so has his own different way of doing it, right? So at the process level, it requires being a little more conscious to really look at what that problem domain is, where you're dwelling in it even more in some levels than the technical side. But again, it's not as obvious to us sometimes to think of the processes, the way we go about doing things, as a problem domain that can be simplified. So the technical processes I'm not going to talk too much about because they tend to be tied very much to the technical design and configuration. For us, specification is definitely something where we've taken that and said, all right, let's for us, we're getting handed these services from a lot of different places, right? Customers with completely different perspectives. So we've put a lot of conscious effort into how do we take that handoff, specify what we need at an operational level, which for us is actually a handoff between the sales department and the operations department, but all the way back into the essentially sales role of what are we in our case selling? What are we providing at an operations infrastructure level? And we say, all right, let's do that. We've worked out, the nitty-gritty isn't all that interesting, but we've worked out how does this work? How can we do this in a way that works for a wide variety of customers, that they don't feel like they're pigeonholed into a process, but when we hand that off, it translates really nicely into how is it going to fit on the operations infrastructure, right? Some of these, like how do we install, test, and troubleshoot code, I would say that's less something that we, going back to the 3 criteria for an economy of focus, the narrow, broad, and owned, some of them are higher up on one criteria than another. The thing with installing, testing, and troubleshooting code, so that part of the deployment process where you said, all right, we've got it running on the operations infrastructure, but is it running correctly, and how do we make sure it is and get to the point where it's going to, when it scales, we're going to be ready for it. The focus there is, we don't get to narrow it quite as much, but we spend a lot of effort owning that process. That's something that we have to be really, really good at. And then even at the project management level, there are, even in terms of how we communicate to customers, what our project status is, we've kind of worked out how to do that in a way that, or how to project manage in a way that we have status for customers that makes sense to them, right? For us, that's a particular problem that we need to solve because we're reporting to customers that, in general, don't have any operations staff. So they don't understand the operations and they don't want to. So we have to learn how to project manage in a way that turns operations stuff into business explanations, things that a manager can make sense of and use. So on the management processes, and by management I mean operations management, I think the first one is one that you get in any mature operations organization, that you get good at your tool set, right? And if you think about it, that is an economy of focus that is something that is, I think, a pretty widely used concept of, all right, we're going to get good at our tool set. We're going to say that the things that we graph or the numbers that we extract, we really know how to use that to identify, oh, your problem is that you're doing a heavy join, right? So getting good at using the tool set, and the reality is there is a lot in common with different web applications. So you can narrow that down pretty well in terms of getting a small set of, relatively small problem to solve. Relatively, I mean, performance management is a huge realm, but narrowing it down to, yes, you need the expertise in-house that can do any kind of performance analysis, but the vast majority of what you do day to day is using the same tools to identify the same set of issues. So we focus in on that. Likewise, Likewise with how do you update things, how do you do your upgrades. As I was talking about with the choice of layers, we've chosen our layers so that we can get those economies of focus. We've got our process for updating the operating system layer, and that just works. We've got our process for updating the layers that are templatized, right? So, okay, we can't just roll out that same package everywhere. We may need to, we have, about a third of our customer base is PHP, and most of them are unique builds because that's the way PHP is, right? So, but we've got a process down that's for the template, the templatized middleware, as I call it, that gets us that we can make it a very routine process. Say, all right, this security issue came out. We do the work on the master, on the gold standard template, and then how do we just build all the others and make sure along the way that we've managed our internal knowledge about the different customers so that we don't trip over something that was unique about that customer. So getting that process down. And again, this is actually, you could look at it as several different economies of focus in terms of how do we update each of those different layers. And I think hardware expansion, just how do you scale at a pure throw more servers at it level, is also what's your tool set. Don't turn it into more or broader problems than you need to. On what I call technology integration is the process of it wasn't that long ago that we took our first Ruby on Rails customer, right? And we need to get to the point where that technology is, so it starts as a one-off the first time we do it, and eventually it gets to something where as much of it as possible is automated, right? And I think, when people talk about this sort of maturing the role of a technology in your organization, the focus tends to be in how do you get it to automated, right? How do you automate as much as possible? In our experience, when you're managing a lot of diversity, yes, getting the scalability, automation is going to be instrumental. But the focus for us is actually much more on that copy and change part. What I mean by copy and change, so you start with the one-off, and then when you implement it the second time, you copy the first one, you make some modifications. Copy it again, third, fourth, fifth. And that process is really how you back to you hire smart people to design processes. That's really where you design your processes and narrow your problem space for your new technology that you're integrating into your infrastructure. So we really focus on how do you get that technology moved through from the one-off side of copy and change, where it's the second time you're implementing it, and in as few iterations as possible, as few times through as possible. How do you get it to the point where it's a template, and then that's something where the amount of attention that it requires drops radically, right? Because you essentially know, all right, let's look at the unique requirements of this service, and then we only need to address those because we've got a good template that addresses everything that isn't unique about a given service that we're implementing. So we, in the sense of ownership, of economies of scale, economies of focus, we really focus on that copy and change part. But also, it's having that focus really helps us design that set of problems that will say, all right, how do we make it so that we've only got 3 or 4 areas that we need to address to implement the vast majority of Rails services that we might be asked to implement, right? How do we narrow down that problem space? So it's in this copy and change cycle where we do a lot of that work on the technical side of creating those small problems that we can build together to be a fairly complete solution or a broadly applicable solution. And then just talk briefly on improvement processes in the sense of how do you make sure your organization keeps getting better at what it does. this is largely, sort of standard operations management practice, but sort of learning from problems. Any operations management teacher, if you will say, all right, you should learn, you do your incident reports, make sure that you actually use them. Part of our focus is let's pay attention to how do we end up using the information from the incident reports, and how do we generate them? Let's narrow down what's the process for doing it so that it's going to give us as much value as possible. Capturing and documenting the knowledge. And again, this sort of is back to that feedback loop of how you build process. You do work, you use that to build processes, and if you do that in an intelligent way, then you're going to be able to use that to narrow down the problem space into these economies of focus. And one that I'm particularly fond of is capturing internal complaints. It's the old, anyone in operations knows you've got these peeves that isn't the way it should be, and that isn't the way it should be, and that isn't the way it should be. We really try to make sure the barrier to putting that into a ticket, in our case, and getting that into not necessarily actionable because it may not be a high enough priority, but make sure that it's that we capture that, and trying to. The interesting thing from an economy of focus angle in this is that we try to say, all right, you run into these peeves in a lot of different places, and some of them are places where you're thick in the middle of something. Some of them are ones where you're kind of surveying things, and let's try to make it so that no matter where you are, you've got something that's a habit, that you use the same easy thing to do to register those complaints in somewhere where it won't just be a peeve forever if it really should get addressed. So kind of looking back, economies of focus, well, you build a high, what I call, high value mesh of areas of mastery, right? You're saying, all right, I'm going to choose these areas that our organization is going to master so that that combination of them is going to get me a lot of value relative to both the amount of effort that we put in along the way in executing those processes, and also the amount of R&D effort or the more training effort in becoming masters in those spaces. And another way to look at it is it's sort of building blocks. The problem with building blocks is they fit together in a certain way, right? A lot of where we do a lot of things in the more templatized way, and that kind of philosophy, we use that to get pieces that are more broadly applicable than building blocks. And just one more way to look at it is it's sort of leveraged economies of scale. How do we get an economy of scale before we're big, right? Well, by focusing in, you get to have these areas where you really are at scale in solving how to implement it in that specific way, because that's what you do more than a much larger organization because you've focused in on that. And then, so what is it buying us? Labor efficiency, right? The whole point is to get more for less work. That's, in our case, that's how do we charge a third of what the big consulting firms do, and in general, making diversity manageable, right? Diversity, no matter how much staffing you have, can become a broad set of problems that don't really fit together well when you're doing it in a single infrastructure, and then also diversity in a lot of environments. The rate at which you implement new applications keeps increasing. So how do you manage all that? So that's my talk, and I'm open to Q&A. Or generally kind of comments on, how does this land for you dealing with a Google scale environment versus us dealing with a much smaller environment? Yeah.
Particular tools that you found valuable in tracking and
yeah. The question was, are there particular tools that we find valuable for this stuff? And the answer is yes, and they're the familiar roster, right? So, we used RT for our ticketing. We use Cacti for our graphing. We use Nagios for our monitoring. We have a custom set of scripts for our automated deployments and automated administration. And then, we use the SLES distro. One of the reasons we chose that distro is we like the way that they do the operating system updates, the AutoYast versus Kickstart thing. Yes?
What do you think about emerging competitors who are even more focused? For example, just offer like one framework. One will do your Rails here for you on the web browser. Or if we just want you, I'm thinking of Zim, for example. If you want to do JavaScript, we're the frame on the web browser.
Yeah. So the question is, what do we think of other competitors who are even more focused than we are, that are going to just focus on certain areas of technology in the way that an engEDU or a Zimkey does? And it's interesting for us, we've gone back and forth on how broad a set of technologies to support. And what we've found is, I do think that at a larger scale than we are, there are benefits in focusing down even further. There's a whole lot. Our experience is, yes, a PHP app versus a Rails app versus a Java app, there are significant areas that are unique to those. But I would say that that's probably about 15% of the total problem space. So yes, you can be even more targeted and focused with a more limited set of technologies, but it's not as big a benefit as it might seem. The other thing that's interesting, and it's sort of the other side of the coin from economies of focus, is we actually learn a lot about, we've learned a lot about caching effectively for Java because we have to solve that problem so much with Rails, right? So, caching is always, any technology, caching is going to be key. Any language, caching is going to be key. But just the way Java is versus the way Rails is, very similar structures in terms of how you need to solve that problem. So there is, at the process design level, there is some cross-pollination between the different technologies. So you can reduce this too small to the point where being too mono-focused is a disadvantage. And that's where the back and forth between having just general senior expertise and getting good at these things. It's not all economies of focus, but I'd say it's a large chunk of what we do. It's more than half of the technical work, probably closer to 3/4. Other questions? All right. Yeah.
So when your staff are working out this process, right, are you communicating to them in terms of trying to think about it in terms of layers, or do you sort of already have a layer set up and keep it in those blocks? Or how do you go about communicating to those documents?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we go about communicating to our staff? Do we say, all right, be thinking about layers, or do we already hand them those layers? The answer is we try to communicate it more as an overall philosophy than as a narrow set, right? And in particular, we talk about things like, okay, during this process of you're implementing our third Rails customer. That's a key time to make sure you're capturing that knowledge and building towards the template, right? But in general, we're really more focused on think about it, right? but it's funny, because it's think about it and don't. On the layers side, right, it's sort of note if the layers aren't working for you in any way. Right? This is sort of the capturing internal complaints. Notice what's out, but don't question things for the sake of questioning them. I mean, occasionally you want to do that, but in general, when you question things as a matter of habit, you end up with too diverse a set of solutions, right? So we try to encourage the thinking at a high level, and there's a lot of do it by the process now. And use doing it by the process as a way to learn how we should be improving the process later, right? But so does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
What about content delivery networks? Do you offer your customers integration with some of them, all of them, or are they on their own?
Yeah. So the question is about content delivery networks and whether we offer our customers integration with them, and the answer is. We've talked about it with a bunch of customers. We haven't actually done that yet, to be honest. What we're looking at, we would manage the relationship and the services from a CDN. We're also looking at a startup that's building some CDN technology that looks like they may be a good match for us to partner with, where they're building the software, we would build the ops infrastructure for that. Because we've already done a lot of tackling tackling some of those global performance issues. We're certainly not masters at that, but I'd say in the last 6 to 9 months, that's become something that comes up a lot. May have to do also with taking on some global 100 companies in Europe. Yeah.
If you were 10 times larger, what would you do differently?
The question is, if we were 10 times larger, what would we do differently? I think the biggest answer is, if we were 10 times larger, there would be more effort spent on the R&D side, more explicit effort spent on the R&D side. I still think the focus would be, so a lot of this, there's some explicit, all right, tool building and just fiddling with the technology in the lab before we actually roll out a live customer with it. But we tend to really try to combine the R&D stuff with the implementation. Even a lot of the tools that we have, they were built to handle a new need for a specific customer, but they were built from day one with that eye towards using them for lots of different customers. If we were larger, I think just as you grow, the resource equation comes out. It makes more sense to, you still want to make sure to collect along the way, this could be improved, this tool would be handy, but to have a little more of a team that's focused on that, I think would just be a little more efficient and would get us some things, would get a lot of those peeves addressed faster. Other questions? Yeah.
Has your architecture that you were describing proceeded across a major release of the underlying operating system?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Has the architecture you described with the layers been tested by the migration of the bottom level operating system across a major version of it?
Yeah, so the question is, has our set of layers been tested across the migration, a major operating system version migration? We actually did, just about 3 months ago, we migrated almost all of our customers. There's still some that, for various reasons, are left behind, from SLES 9 to SLES 10. They're both 2.6 kernels, but it's complete upgrade on all the different toolset layers. And it actually was a lot less painful than we expected. And I think part of it is that the different layers that we sit on top, the layers that a lot of that template-based middleware, what we found is, because we're used to those layers, rebuilding those frequently, because they're getting built for little customizations here and there, it was relatively easy to say, all right, we've got to figure out a couple of things at the base level for Apache or Java or PHP that need to change when we upgrade the operating system. But mostly the layers, there weren't too many painful layers because the right layers were being rebuilt, right? The right layers where we do our customizations, we're used to rebuilding anyway. That's part of the standard process is, change the config.nice and set it going and build a new package from it. That really I think made it a lot easier. The fact that we had that layer specifically separate, clearly distinguished from the operating system layer, as opposed to having a set of tools that sometimes are in the OS and sometimes not. Yes.
Did that extend also to a 32 to 64-bit transition? Did you have a scorched earth of your custom stuff?
Yeah. So the question was, did that extend also from a 32 to a 64-bit transition? The reality is most of our customers have started 64-bit. So we were using Opterons as of I think 3 years ago. So it hasn't really been, and we've been doing this. The company's been around for over 8 years, but in terms of really this business model, we've been doing that about 3.5. And so we were pretty small by the time we were pretty much got started on 64-bit. Other questions?
One more question.
Yeah.
Are there customers you turn away because they're the wrong technologies? They can't focus technology.
So the question is, are there customers we turn away because they're not the right technology, or because we think they can't be focused? We can't get the economies of focus there. And the answer is sort of no and yes. In general, our sort of pricing model is that we're willing to customize as much as you want, but you're going to pay for that level of customization. If you're going to be a one-off, you're not going to get the economy of focus pricing that says, if you're really going to need custom this, custom that all the way through, it's just going to be a lot more expensive, but that'll pay for itself. And that in effect ends up turning away some customers, definitely. The other kind of customer that we tend to turn away are customers that we will turn away a customer that will not truly do it outsourced. If they say we still want some administrative access on these servers, that's a showstopper, right? We learned very early that sharing responsibility means that we do way more work, not less, by letting them take on some piece of the problem. Because they're not going to be integrated, even if they have just as good an ops team as we do, which isn't generally going to be the case. But even if they did, they're going to have a different way of slicing up the problem domain. Their focuses are going to be different, and without them being really tightly integrated into our organization, we're going to lose those economies even on the areas where we do it already, if they're tackling the problems from a different perspective on the same infrastructure. Cool. Anything else? Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.